Since the 1970s, our school mascot has been the Crusaders. Many people today have a strong negative opinion about the Crusades, but it is an opinion formed with access to almost no facts. The gap between the historical reality and common opinion is so great that some professional historians have given up trying to close it. As Catholics, especially having taken the name Crusaders for our school and athletic program, it is important that we understand this era of our history. As modern Catholics, we should not be embarrassed by the medieval Crusades. In their age, and at their best, they were errands of mercy to right terrible wrongs. For medieval men and women, the crusade was an act of piety, charity, and love, as well as a means of defending their world, their culture, and their way of life. Learning about the Crusades can also provide lessons for our parish's participation in sports as students, coaches, and parents. There is much we can learn from those cruces signati, or those signed with the cross. The Crusades occurred during the Middle Ages in Europe, during 1095 to 1291 AD, about 700 to 900 years ago. At that time, Christianity had spread from its beginnings in Israel to all of Europe. While Europe was almost entirely Roman Catholic, the Christians living in the Holy Land had been troubled by 400 years of enemy conquests, already losing about 2/3 of their lands. Those invaders did not share the Christian faith, but were of the Islamic or Muslim religion. Mohammed, the founder of the Islamic religion, at the end of his life instructed his followers to fight all men until they say there is no God but Allah. Mohammed's teachings on building a community united in political and military purpose oriented Islam toward its imperialistic expansion. While the Muslim world was united in language and religion, it was broken into regional centers of power, Sunni and Shiite. Muslim armies had captured all the Christian areas surrounding the Holy Land and into North Africa by the year 700 AD. Initially, there was no response from the Christian world. From 1009 to 1021 AD, Christians and Jews were persecuted by the Egyptian Fatimid Muslims, not being allowed to show crosses publicly, use wine for the celebration of the Eucharist, and forced to witness the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the place of Jesus' empty tomb. Soon after, a new group of Muslims, the Seljuk Turks, arrived and destroyed Christian churches, murdered priests, and seized pilgrims traveling to the holy sites. For example, in 1065 AD, a group of 12,000 pilgrims were massacred by the Turks on Good Friday, only 2 days from reaching Jerusalem. The Christians of the East, part of the Byzantine Empire, tried to defend themselves, but after their bitter defeat at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, the Turks established themselves at the city of Nicaea, within striking distance of the Byzantine capital at Constantinople. The Byzantine emperor sent word to the Pope. Unable to do anything to defend themselves, the Byzantine Christians of the East turned to the Roman Catholics of the West for help. Blessed Pope Urban II gave a speech at the Council of Clermont in 1095 AD that changed the world. Pope Urban spoke of the liberation of the holy city of Jerusalem, the violent activities of the Turks, and gave the exhortation to take up arms and defend their brothers and sisters in the Holy Land. This was the call for a crusade. Urban also offered the spiritual incentive of a plenary indulgence, which provided the main motivator for those who undertook the journey. To understand why a plenary indulgence was such a motivating factor, we need to remember what indulgences are. Perhaps not talked about as much today, indulgences are still an important part of our Catholic faith. Sin harms our relationship with God, and when we commit mortal sin, we cut ourselves off from Him. Jesus gave us the sacrament of reconciliation by which our sins are forgiven. After our sins are forgiven, there still remain some effects of that sin. To give an analogy, when I broke a window as a child, my parents forgave me, but I was still punished with the consequence of having to work to help pay to replace the window. In the same way, our sins have effects that we need to do penance for. We do penance through prayers or good acts which help to purify us and open us up more to God's grace. A partial indulgence removes part of the temporal punishment due for sins. A plenary indulgence removes all of it. These consequences may come either in this life in the form of various sufferings, or in the next life in purgatory. What we don't get rid of here, we suffer there. In the past, one might find prayers with a list of days, for example, 300 days partial indulgence. This did not mean that one gets out of 300 days of purgatory. We don't know how time works in purgatory. But rather that praying it gives someone a partial indulgence equal to what the early Christians got for doing penances for 300 days. Really, all the Church ever says about the length of time of our temporal punishment, including time in purgatory, is that it would be reduced, as God sees fit. Indulgences are one way that the Church applies the grace coming from Jesus' passion and death to individual members to remove those temporal effects of sin. Now we can understand better why a plenary indulgence for participating in a crusade was so attractive. Crusaders were not saints. Indeed, they were terrible sinners. These men were professional warriors. They lived by the sword and were deeply aware of the fact that they were endangering their eternal life by doing so. As an act of charity and love of neighbor, the crusade provided a means for these men to use the one thing they knew how to do well, to fight, for the salvation rather than the perdition of their souls. The crusade would serve as a full penance for all the Crusaders' sins. That is why they crusaded. The First Crusade was the only campaign in history that saw thousands of warriors march thousands of miles deep into enemy territory for no good strategic reason. As scholars have learned over the last 50 years, the Crusades only make sense when we understand the pious idealism that lies behind them. Crusaders took a vow to visit the Holy Sepulchre, the place of Jesus' empty tomb. They also often took upon themselves vows of fasting, abstinence from sex, or other devotions. Upon taking the vow, a simple cross was sewn on their shoulder. Thus, these pilgrim warriors came to be known as Cruci Signati, or those signed with the cross. The terms Crusader and Crusade are modern names. While the Crusades had this good and noble purpose of defending Christians and pilgrims in the Holy Land, visiting the holy sites, and doing penance for sins, because they were taken up by human beings whose sin, both good and bad, came out of them. This is true for anything that we do. We can do good or evil, and sometimes we may want to do good, but make bad choices and sin. At St. Columbkille, we have taken the name of Crusaders because we want to imitate the good virtues of the medieval Christian Crusaders in the way we participate in our sports. But just like they did at the time of the Crusades, we can misuse a good thing. We should not conclude based on the sins of some of its participants that the Crusades were all bad, just as we should not conclude that sports are bad, because sometimes some of us act badly when we play them. Instead, we can use the story of the Crusades as a way to reflect on our own participation in sports as a St. Columbkille Crusader, a disciple of Christ who has been signed with the cross from our baptism. Just as the Crusaders took a vow before leaving on their crusade, so too do we make a promise before we participate in sports at St. Columbkille. Players, coaches, and parents each sign a commitment to act as disciples of Jesus Christ while having fun playing, coaching, and watching our sporting events. For example, players promise to do their best to maintain appropriate behavior, treat each other, coaches, officials, and parents with respect and dignity, encourage and pray for their teammates, and give their best effort at practices and games. Coaches promise to begin and end practices and games with a prayer, reinforce positive behavior, place the well-being of their players ahead of their own desire to win, treat each player as an individual, emphasize effort, hustle, attendance at practice and games, sportsmanship and teamwork, and value effort and Christian attitude over winning. Parents are expected to encourage good sportsmanship by demonstrating positive support for all players, coaches, and officials at every game and practice, to place the well-being of their child ahead of any personal desire to win, to refrain from using abusive language and from contradicting or belittling coaches, officials, players, or other teams, and to remember that the athletic program at St. Columbkille Parish is part of the parish's effort to form disciples of Jesus. It is good to be reminded of these promises because just like some of the Crusaders who failed to live up to the vow they made, we can sometimes get caught up in wanting to win and forget what sports are supposed to be about. The First Crusade consisted of about 40,000 men. Only a small minority were knights, and most knights were lords of their estates. Most noblemen who joined the crusade did so from a simple and sincere love of God. Their personal cost was enormous. To go on a crusade, it cost about 5 to 6 times a knight's annual income. But, as is still true, people gladly march off to horrible wars if they believe that the cause for which they fight is noble, true, and greater than themselves. These were men of the sword, pious and idealistic, but also crude, arrogant, and at times savage. The crusade provided a means for such men to turn their talent for warfare and bloodshed into a means of their own salvation. Before the main crusade left Europe, a group inspired by the preaching of Peter the Hermit and impatient to wait for the soldiers and nobles left early on what became known as the People's Crusade. Unfortunately, this People's Crusade was attacked by the Turks and forced either to convert to Islam or be killed. There were other smaller groups who began journeys, but instead attacked Jewish communities seeking riches. Local Catholic bishops tried to protect these Jewish communities, but many were killed. Right away, we see how a good and noble purpose can go wrong with our own selfishness. The same is true for sports. If a player gets impatient in a game, he might begin to make mistakes that lose the game. Parents and coaches must be patient with their children, not expecting more from them than they should, simply because they want to win. Impatience can lead us to say things that ultimately cause more harm than good. Traveling by land, the main crusade took about 4 months to reach Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Though the Byzantine Emperor had asked for their help, tension remained between the Western lords and the Eastern Emperor, as each vied for authority over each other. Part of that tension was undoubtedly the fact that the Eastern Christians did not recognize the authority of the Pope, and so were considered schismatics. Moving on, the crusade reached the Holy Land and through a series of battles regained the cities of Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and Bethlehem for Christian rule. The Crusaders failed on their first attack of Jerusalem. In preparation for a second attack, the soldiers of Christ built siege works, fasted, and walked as barefoot pilgrims around the city. This could make us think of the Old Testament battle of Jericho, when the Jewish people marched around the city walls with the Ark of the Covenant. The Crusaders' second attempt was successful. Both Muslims and Jews were killed in the initial battles, but after Jerusalem's conquest, many were allowed to purchase their freedom or were expelled from the city. Just as the Crusaders did not give up after their first failure to capture Jerusalem, so we too must not get upset when we lose sometimes. We must try again, and working together we can do better. Notice that the knights also changed the way they fought. They started by making a prayerful pilgrimage around the city. It is also important for us to start each game that we play with a prayer. Not because God will make sure that we win, but because we ask Him that everyone can have fun playing, be protected from getting hurt, and be His disciples even on the court or field. Pope Urban's desire was to have the conquered lands returned to the Byzantine Empire, but due to their poor relationship with the emperor, the Crusade leaders instead formed independent Crusader States under Western authority. The Turks were too divided among themselves to unite for a counter-jihad, or holy war, against the Christian Crusaders. It was during this time that the first military orders were formed. These were religious orders formed by a number of the fighting men who desired to go beyond their initial Crusader vow and give their entire life to Christ. Like any religious order, they took the 3 vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They also took a vow to protect pilgrims coming from the holy sites. The Order of the Knights Templar are most well known for their white tunics with a red cross. The formation of their order was supported by the preaching of St. Bernard of Clairvaux. Unfortunately, their involvement in providing banking services to pilgrims led to their eventual suppression. The Knights of the Hospital of St. John, or Hospitallers, were originally started to take care of sick pilgrims, not as a military organization. But through the course of the Crusades, castles were turned over to them, forcing them to have a military branch of the order. Later, during the Third Crusade, a third military order, the Teutonic Knights, would also be formed. These military orders provided stability to the Crusader States, as permanent soldiers dedicated to the defense of the Holy Land. The men who started these military orders knew there was more to life than fighting battles. So too, we should remember sports, while fun and important, are not the only thing that matters. We also want to help our children do their best in other areas like academics, other activities, growing in virtue. The knights and the military orders wanted to use the talents that they had to do God's work, and so should we. Overall, the First Crusade was a great success. Under threat from Muslim jihad, the Crusader states needed more support to survive. Pope Eugenius III called for a Second Crusade. It was supported in Europe by preachers like St. Bernard of Clairvaux. Knowing the disgraces of the First Crusade, St. Bernard stressed that Jews were not to be persecuted. Still, the Second Crusade ended up being a disaster. The Crusaders failed in both their attempts to recapture Edessa and take Damascus. The Crusader states would really have been better off without the Second Crusade. Like the Second Crusade, we will not always win. Sometimes we will lose our games. There will be many times in our life outside of sports when we may not get what we want. God's will is not always our own. But it never means that God does not love and care for us. He always hears our prayers, but sometimes He does not say yes because He has something better in store in the future. With God, good can even come out of our failures. Following the Second Crusade, as the Christian Crusader states, especially the Kingdom of Jerusalem, showed signs of weakness and disunity, there arose a strong Muslim leader, Saladin. Saladin was deeply religious and called for jihad and Muslim purification. After uniting the Muslim kingdoms of Egypt and Syria, Saladin declared war on the Christians. More out of personal pride than anything, King Guy of Jerusalem made an ill-advised attack on Saladin's forces at what has become known as the Battle at the Horns of Hattin in 1187 AD. This would be the greatest defeat in crusading history. The entire massive Christian army was killed or captured. Saladin executed all the Hospitallers and Templars. Common Christian soldiers that could not purchase their freedom were sold as slaves. The true cross which the Crusaders had carried with them into battle was taken by the Muslim forces and paraded upside down in Damascus. The battle at the Horns of Hattin left Jerusalem defenseless. Jerusalem was forced to surrender to Saladin, who was going to massacre all its Christian inhabitants, but instead allowed them to leave if they could pay for their freedom. Those who could not were sold into slavery. Christian churches were pillaged. After 2 years of Saladin's conquests, the Christians had only Tripoli, Antioch, and Tyre left to them. Sometimes it is our sins that lead to our other failures. Here it was the pride of King Guy that led to the Christians being defeated by Saladin's armies. Pride is one of the 7 deadly sins because it is often pride behind our other sinful actions. Pride might prevent us from asking for help when we need it. It is pride that makes us selfish rather than working as a team. Pride can prevent us from admitting when we are wrong and apologizing. Instead, we must be humble enough to admit when we are wrong. Those in the Crusader States had been requesting more help from Europe for years, but there was much fighting going on back in Europe, even among the different Christian kingdoms. News of the defeat at Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem shocked Europe. Pope Gregory VIII called for a 7-year truce in Europe so that a new crusade could begin. The loss of Jerusalem, the Pope said, had come because of the sins of Christians. This Third Crusade would mark the height of the Crusades. It was the largest military enterprise of the Middle Ages, led by kings and the highest nobles. The greatest of its leaders was King Richard I of England, called the Lionheart. King Richard was a man of chivalry and bold action, perhaps the best military mind of the Middle Ages. Instead of traveling by land, he went by sea, first capturing the island of Cyprus, which would become an important access point near the coast of Palestine. Once he arrived in the Holy Land, Richard took charge of the various forces that had arrived from different countries. Richard marched slowly along the coast from Jaffa toward Jerusalem, but realized that Jerusalem would never fall while Saladin continued to have power. Richard was willing to lay down his own life in attacking Jerusalem, but did not want to be responsible for the deaths of so many men in a plan that would surely fail. The idea to attack Egypt was discussed, but never happened because Richard needed to return to Europe to save his own kingdom, which was in danger there. Richard was able to moderate a 3-year truce with the Muslims that allowed pilgrims to travel freely throughout Palestine to all the holy sites. Even though they failed to recapture Jerusalem, the Third Crusade was highly successful. The Crusader kingdom was healed of its divisions, many of its coastal cities were restored, and peace with its greatest enemy was, for the time being, secured. King Richard I planned to return after those 3 years, but never did. Meanwhile, Saladin died, and Muslim unity died with him. King Richard is an example of a strong leader, a leader who cared not for his own glory, but for the needs and safety of others. It was the leadership of Richard that made the Third Crusade so successful. Sports teams will also be more successful the better the leadership of their team. Coaches lead their team by knowing the strengths and weaknesses of their players to help them work together. The good coach strives to get all players involved. The coach leads the team not simply to victories on the court or field, but also to growth in virtue. As Pope Benedict XVI has described, sports practiced with enthusiasm and an acute ethical sense, especially for youth, become a training ground for healthy competition and physical improvement, a school of formation in the human and spiritual values, a privileged means for personal growth and contact with society. Good leadership can make this happen more easily. The loss of Jerusalem continued to trouble the people of Europe, so in 1198 Pope Innocent III proclaimed a Fourth Crusade. The Pope called for the reconquest of Jerusalem. Those who could not fight should fast and pray. King Richard I died before he could take part, so the Fourth Crusade ended up being led not by kings, but by powerful lords. The idea remained that it would be impossible to take and hold Jerusalem while the Turks retained power. So the plan was to travel by sea to capture Egypt before going to the Holy Land. A fleet of ships and provisions were gathered in Venice, enough for over 33,000 men. Unfortunately, this was a gross overestimation, for only a third of that number showed up. Consequently, the Crusaders could not pay their bill to the Venetians. The Crusaders had the choice either to dissolve the crusade or help the Venetians reclaim the city of Zara to help offset the debt. Since Zara was a Christian city, Pope Innocent III would not allow a Christian crusade to be used to fight other Christians. The Pope sent word that attacking Zara would bring excommunication on all those involved. Some of the Crusaders did not take part, but many of the Crusaders helped the Venetians capture Zara anyway. Some appealed to the Pope for forgiveness afterward, and the penalty of excommunication was lifted. but the Venetians refused to admit wrong. Still under the pressure to complete paying off their debt, the Crusaders were asked to help Alexius Angelus, a former Byzantine emperor now in exile, to return to Constantinople and reclaim his right as emperor. The promise of money, alliance with the Byzantines, and more soldiers for their crusade was stronger than Pope Innocent's opposition to the crusade being used for this purpose. The Crusaders thought that they could perform a good deed, save themselves from poverty, and strengthen the crusade. Pope Innocent insisted that they were not to seize or plunder Greek lands, but the Crusaders assumed upon the word of Alexius that there would be no need to attack Constantinople. Thus the crusade escorted Alexius to Constantinople, but the people of Constantinople did not immediately accept him back. The crusade ended up having to attack the city before Alexius regained the position of emperor. The crusade then wished to leave immediately for Egypt, the crusade's original purpose, but were forced to stay as Alexius tried to make good on his promises. Alexius became greatly unpopular to his own people, as he even destroyed church items like chalices and icons in an attempt to pay his debt to the Crusaders. In the meantime, a small group of the Westerners set fire to a mosque, which inadvertently spread into one of the worst urban fires in history. Feeling slighted by the emperor, Crusaders began raiding the land to pay themselves. Even the bishops in the crusade justified an attack on the city. The ordinary Crusader soldier had no idea that the verdict of their bishops contradicted the commands of the Pope. The Crusaders succeeded in their attempts to take the city in 1204. What followed has become known as the sack of Constantinople. A sack of a city that resisted capture was acceptable in medieval moral code, but the Crusaders did much more than just plunder. The crusading host and the Latin refugees merged into a hideous mob driven by greed, lust, and hatred. They broke into palaces, stripped altars of precious furnishings, smashed icons for the sake of their silver and gems, and even defiled the consecrated Eucharist in precious blood. The radiant church Hagia Sophia was stripped of everything of value. Icons were shipped back to Europe, artwork was destroyed, women were molested. For most Europeans, the outcome of the Fourth Crusade was God's vengeance on the Greeks for their betrayal of the Holy Land. To the Byzantines, the sense of betrayal and anger towards the Latins continue in many even to today. To Pope Innocent, it was a grave tragedy, as he tried to offer apology. While it is something of a myth that St. John Paul II apologized for the Crusades, he was actually criticized for not including the Crusades in a list of apologies. He did apologize explicitly for the sack of Constantinople. In Athens in 2001, he apologized to the Greek people. Some memories are especially painful, and some events of the distant past have left deep wounds in the minds and hearts of the people to this day. I am thinking of the disastrous sack of the imperial city of Constantinople, which was for so long the bastion of Christianity in the East. It is tragic that the assailants, who had set out to secure free access for Christians to the Holy Land, turned against their own brothers in the faith. The fact that they were Latin Christians fills Catholics with deep regret. How can we fail to see here the mysterium iniquitatis at work in the human heart? To God alone belongs judgment, and therefore we entrust the heavy burden of the past to his endless mercy, imploring him to heal the wounds which still cause suffering to the spirit of the Greek people. Even if the idea of the Crusade was in fact a just war, there were individual actions done by Christians that were contrary to justice and morality. That is why St. John Paul II apologized, not for the Crusades themselves, but for the actions of Christians that were against the values of the gospel. Ultimately, the Fourth Crusade did nothing but weaken both the Byzantine Empire and the Crusader States. It was a disaster. In the same way, sports are meant to be a great good, but can be used for ill. If practices, games, and tournaments become so prominent that they push Sunday Mass to second place, we need to remind ourselves of sport's true goal. Also, during the events themselves, do we allow our excitement and competitiveness to prevent us from treating others, parents, coaches, refs, athletes, as the children of God that they are? Winning is good, but it is not the greatest good. And it is a tragedy worse than the sack of Constantinople when we allow sports to take the place of God. The so-called Children's Crusade of 1212 was neither a crusade nor an army of children. It was a particularly large eruption of popular religious enthusiasm in Germany that led some young people, mostly teens and young adults, to proclaim themselves Crusaders and begin marching to the sea. Along the way, they gathered plenty of popular support and not a few brigands, robbers, and beggars as well. The movement splintered in Italy and finally ended when the Mediterranean Sea failed to dry up for them to cross. Pope Innocent III did not call this crusade. Indeed, he repeatedly urged non-combatants to stay at home, helping the war effort through fasting, prayer, and almsgiving. In this case, he praised the zeal of the young who had marched so far, and then told them to go home. One group, unfortunately, was offered passage to the Holy Land by unscrupulous men, and ended up being sold as slaves in Egypt. This popular attempt at a crusade came to a humiliating end. The enthusiasm of the young people who went on the Children's Crusade is like our enthusiasm for the things that we enjoy or are important to us, which can include sports. This excitement is good, but we also need to make sure our emotions don't get the best of us, leading us to make poor decisions. That is what happened with the enthusiasm of the Children's Crusade. They did not listen to the leaders of the church who only wanted their good. So too, we need to listen to those in authority, as well as help our children be guided by parents and coaches. Christians in Europe still had a strong desire to recapture Jerusalem and rescue the true cross. Since the Fourth Crusade had failed from the start, Pope Innocent III called for a Fifth Crusade in 1213 AD. The destination of a crusade in the minds of many was Egypt, first before Jerusalem. So instead of an armed pilgrimage to the Holy Land, the idea of a crusade became reformed into a papally sanctioned war against the enemies of faith. Instead of traveling to Jerusalem to fulfill their vow, the vow would be filled by a set period of military service. Since the demise of the Fourth Crusade was lack of funds, the Pope offered the Crusader Indulgence to those who could not travel and fight, but could rather support the crusade financially. Unfortunately, this was the seed that would, 300 years later, grow into the weeds of abuses that led to the Protestant Reformation. This Fifth Crusade was plagued with too many leaders and no clear consensus of what to do. They anticipated Frederick II, King of Sicily and the German Empire, to come, but he never did. Also, the army was continually changing because the Crusader Vow was fulfilled for the individual soldier after a certain period of time. Finally, in Egypt, they decided to lay siege to the important port city of Damietta on the Nile Delta. The Muslim Sultan, Al-Kamil, attempted to make a deal with the Crusaders, handing over Jerusalem, the True Cross, and a 30-year truce for the end of the siege, but the deal was refused. At one point, St. Francis of Assisi came to try to convert Al-Kamil to Christianity, but was unsuccessful. Damietta finally fell to the Crusaders without a fight, but they found many of its inhabitants sick or dead because of the siege. The Crusaders cared for and baptized many orphaned children. From Damietta, the Crusaders were still divided as to what to do next. They decided to attack Mansoura, but were surrounded by Muslim troops and were forced to surrender. The terms of the surrender forced them to give up Damietta and leave Egypt for an 8-year truce. The True Cross was never returned. The Fifth Crusade had repeatedly been on the brink of fantastic success, yet due to a lack of competent leadership, it ended in humiliating failure. Once again, the Fifth Crusade teaches us that without strong leaders and the willingness to listen to them, we are not likely to succeed. Part of the reason the Fifth Crusade failed was the lack of leadership. Frederick II of Germany would have been the obvious leader, but though he took the Crusader Vow, he never showed up to take part. Reminded continually to make good on his vow, he finally incurred the penalty of excommunication. Due to a marriage, he ended up also becoming King of Jerusalem, which finally motivated him enough to travel to the Holy Land. Due to the excommunication, Frederick was unpopular and distrusted by his men because a crusade was not simply a military campaign, but an act of devotion and a means of salvation, so could not be led by an excommunicant. Instead of attempting to rescue Jerusalem, Frederick made a deal with the Muslim Sultan Al-Kamil. Frederick was given Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth during a 10-year truce, but Jerusalem would have to remain defenseless and unfortified, and the Muslims would be allowed to administer their own people separately. It was merely a legalistic victory, and after the truce expired, the Muslims simply took Jerusalem back. St. Louis IX, King of France, went on 2 crusades, which were really the greatest devotional acts of his life. Today he is more thought of for his care of the poor and devotion to the Eucharist, since those acts translate much better to our own time than waging war to defend Christians in the Middle East. Still, for Louis, the liberation of Jerusalem was the single most cherished goal in his life. He decided to follow the plan of the Fifth Crusade and returned to Egypt to lay siege to Damietta. Upon arrival, they found the city undefended and empty, for the residents did not want a repeat of the destructive siege of the Fifth Crusade. Just like the Fifth Crusade, they again marched to Mansoura. Another Crusader lord, Robert of Artois, foolishly decided to prematurely attack without Louis, and the results were disastrous. Almost all of Robert's forces were killed. After a bloody battle just to survive, Louis's forces lacked enough numbers to even try to attack Mansoura. They were forced to surrender. The nobility, including Louis, were taken prisoner, but the poor and sick Crusaders were massacred. Even after Louis and the nobility were released, thousands remained in hostage. Having failed in Egypt, Louis traveled to the Holy Land to see what he could do for the Christians there. Though he had no legal authority, he was received as the virtual ruler of Jerusalem for the 4 years he was there. Louis's presence helped cool factions among the Christians living in Jerusalem. He improved the defenses at several cities and established a garrison of knights at Acre. Louis then had to return to France. During his absence, the Mamluk Sultan Barbar waged a vigorous jihad, massacring or enslaving Christians wherever he found them. At Antioch, the entire population, including women and children, was killed, the single greatest massacre of the entire crusading era. Up to that point, Antioch had been the oldest of the crusading states, lasting 170 years. St. Louis's Second Crusade in 1270 was even better organized than his first, but did not head to the Holy Land nor to Egypt. Instead, it sought to fend off the Muslim influence closer to home, at Tunis, a city across the Mediterranean Sea from Sicily. Tunis was thought to be relatively weak and would only be a brief stop on the way to the east. The Crusaders easily captured Carthage, but then decided to wait for Charles of Anjou and his knights to join them from Sicily. They ended up waiting 6 months through the summer heat. There was an outbreak of diseases in the Crusader camp, leading to many of the soldiers' deaths. King Louis's son John was among those who died, and Louis, stricken with grief, himself fell ill and died. The Second Crusade of St. Louis failed to achieve anything, not even to reach their final destination. We can compare Frederick II and St. Louis IX and their crusades. In the eyes of the world, Frederick was more successful than Louis. Frederick was able to regain several of the holy cities, including Jerusalem, during a 10-year truce, while Louis failed to gain any lands or cities. But in the eyes of the Christians of the Middle Ages and until today, it is Louis, not Frederick, that has become the model of the selfless warrior of Christ. While both took the Crusader vow to visit the holy sites and give protection to residents and pilgrims to the Holy Land, St. Louis was guided entirely by his love of God and the desire to show charity to his fellow brothers and sisters in the East. Frederick, on the other hand, refusing to keep his vow, incurred the penalty of excommunication. Instead of seeking forgiveness from God and reconciliation with the Church, he finally did go to Jerusalem, not motivated by spiritual reasons, but only to gain worldly power. This is an important lesson for us, not just for our participation in sports, but in all that we do. As Jesus taught, what profit would there be for one to gain the whole world and forfeit his life? Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. It is much better having to suffer losing sometimes in our sports activities while acting as disciples of Jesus, rather than being one who wins at all costs, even to sacrifice going to Mass, spending time with God, or treating others with disrespect. We too want to be selfless warriors for Jesus, following the example of St. Louis. Muslim power continued to grow as Christian leadership weakened. In 1291, Muslim forces laid siege to Acre, the greatest of the Christian strongholds in Palestine. The Christian knights were greatly outnumbered and were utterly destroyed. The result was that the Christians had lost their last effective army. A responding crusade was never able to be formed. The 14th century lacked strong popes that would call and support a great general crusade. Smaller crusades were attempted, but they would now be wars of defense against the enemies of the faith, rather than pilgrimages. With the rise of the Ottoman Turks in the mid-1300s, it was no longer faraway Palestine that was in danger, but Western Europe itself. Crusaders had always seen themselves as fighting a defensive war, defending the Christians in the East, Jerusalem, or the faith. Now they were called on to defend themselves. Henceforth, Crusades were no longer wars to expand Christendom, but desperate attempts to slow the advance of Islam. Crusading had become a matter of simple survival. In crusades such as that of Nicopolis in 1395 and Varna in 1444, the Christian army was crushed by the Turks. In 1453, after a 2-month siege, the great Christian city of Constantinople fell to the invading Turks. The greatest Christian church in the world, the Hagia Sophia, was converted into a mosque. One place where Christian Europe had success in defending themselves was in Spain. After 7 centuries of warfare, in 1492, the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain, was complete. In the early 16th century, Pope Leo X made a final attempt at a serious crusade, but no crusade happened. The Protestant Reformation further divided Christians. For Protestants, crusading was impossible, for it presupposed obedience to the Pope, the unity of Christendom, and the spiritual benefits of indulgences. Really, the first major victory of the Christians against the Ottoman Turks was the naval battle of Lepanto in 1571. The feast of Our Lady of the Rosary marks the anniversary of this crusade victory. By the 17th century, Europe was undergoing great expansion, forming colonies outside Europe itself, so the Turks were really no longer a threat. Even smaller crusade campaigns were at their end. With crusading over, what became of those military orders? Back in 1291, with the loss of all the Crusader States in the Holy Land, many blamed the military orders. Remember, the Knights Templar had gotten involved in banking services for pilgrims to the Holy Land. King Philip IV of France, seeking to seize their wealth, ordered the arrest of all Templars in France in 1307. Under torture, Templar leaders were forced to admit a host of sins and crimes. Those who refused to confess were burned at the stake. Under extreme pressure from King Philip, Pope Clement V was forced to suppress the Knights Templar in 1312. The order, established by Christian knights taking the vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, and the protection of pilgrims, was no more. The Knights of the Hospital of St. John, or Hospitallers, became known better as the Knights of Malta, after the island upon which they were stationed. Their military function ended when Napoleon captured Malta. The Teutonic Knights also still exist, being headquartered in Vienna. Today, both the Knights of Malta and the Teutonic Knights are still doing what they were originally created to do: charitable works and care for the sick. During the Middle Ages, Christian Europe saw the Crusades as armed pilgrimages, charitable acts of defending fellow Christians from the persecution of invaders, as well as a means of penance and spiritual benefit for those men who lived their life by the sword. The Crusade developed later into papally sanctioned wars of defense, necessary even to retain their Christian way of life in Europe. In the Muslim world, the Crusades were all but forgotten, because from their point of view, the Crusades had little effect at all. In the medieval Muslim world, there was nothing to distinguish the Crusades from any other wars they fought against infidels. The Crusades had been unsuccessful and were thus irrelevant. But today, the popular understanding of the medieval Crusades is very different. This view of the Crusades began to change in the 17th century as European wealth and power made the medieval Crusades seem unnecessary. Also, as the Christian faith became less important to many, Enlightenment thinkers began to ridicule the Crusades as wars of intolerance. The modern idea of imperialism was then projected onto the Crusades, making them into wars of European expansion to bring the fruits of the Western world to the backward Muslim world. So, while the idea of imperialism was a positive one, so were the Crusades seen as positive. During World War I, crusading imagery was used in propaganda, which further extracted the element of religion. The word crusade increasingly came to denote a grand and glorious campaign for a morally just goal, yet one that was secular rather than religious. In this context, the Crusades were seen as good, but that changed as the nature of imperialism was discredited by the 1950s. In the 1950s, Sir Stephen Runciman wrote A History of the Crusades that has almost single-handedly crafted the current popular concept of the Crusades. In it, Crusaders are portrayed as simpletons or barbarians, seeking salvation through the destruction of the sophisticated cultures of the East. Runciman concluded, "The Holy War itself was nothing more than a long act of intolerance in the name of God, which is the sin against the Holy Ghost." His verdict has become the standard for popular books and media. Muslim perceptions of the Crusades also changed in the 20th century, for they were reintroduced to the Crusades through this new European understanding of imperialism. In the wake of the World Wars, European colonial powers took control of the Middle East, bringing with them the concept of the Crusades. The creation of the State of Israel was associated with the medieval Crusader kingdom. The fact that Israel was Jewish was irrelevant. Saddam Hussein, the former president of Iraq, regularly referred to himself as a new Saladin. American military bases in Saudi Arabia were described as a return of Crusader forces. Osama bin Laden's declaration of jihad in 1998 described his jihad as against Jews and Crusaders. The September 11th attacks of 2001 were viewed by Islamicists as an act of jihad against a crusading state. The war of the United States on Afghanistan and Islamist terrorism was also seen through the lens of the Crusades. In reality, the Crusades were not a form of imperialism. They had no beneficial effect on Europe's economy. Indeed, they constituted a massive drain on resources. The Crusades contributed nothing to the decline of the Muslim world. The Crusades may have slowed the advance of Islam, though how much can be questioned. It did hinder unification of a single Islamic state. The Crusades did play a part in the eventual neutralization of the Muslim threat to Europe, especially in the Reconquista in Spain. But how did the Crusades lead to the present conflict in the Middle East? The simple answer is that they did not. It was not the Crusades, but the artificial memory of the Crusades, constructed by modern colonial powers and passed down by Arab nationalists and Islamicists. The Crusades were not wars of conversion, not wars of colonialism, not looting expeditions, not wars against Islam, not a tool of a threatened papacy, not to bring spices and wealth to Europe to bolster its economy. And they did not materially damage the Islamic empires and therefore have nothing at all to do with the current state of the Middle East. They were a belated response to more than 4 centuries of Muslim conquests of Christian lands. They were a direct response to a plea for help from the Christians of the Middle East. Crusaders were not saints. Indeed, they were terrible sinners. That's why they spent enormous amounts of their own wealth and put their lives in great danger for those faraway campaigns as acts of charity and penance for the salvation of their own souls. Yes, the Crusades were wars, so that means that people died. But the numbers of those killed in the Crusades, while lamentable, has been grossly exaggerated. There is a common thought that religion has caused the deaths of more people than any other idea conceived by man. That is simply absurd. Massacres occurred during the Crusades, of course, but they were relatively rare. One of the worst examples, after the Crusader conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, approximately 3,500 Muslims and Jews were killed. That is not good. But how does that compare to modern non-religious wars? For example, during World War II, a war of modern ideologies, that same number were killed every 3 hours, around the clock, 24/7, for 6 straight years. Nothing in the Middle Ages, no war or religious persecution of any sort, could come close to the wholesale slaughter communism visited on the 20th century, an ideology that banned religion of all kinds. As Catholics today, we should not be embarrassed by the medieval Crusades. In their age, and at their best, they were errands of mercy to right terrible wrongs. For medieval men and women, the crusade was an act of piety, charity, and love, as well as a means of defending their world, their culture, and their way of life. As is still true, people gladly march off to horrible wars if they believe that the cause for which they fight is noble, true, and greater than themselves. We must not take from this consideration of the Crusades that violence is good. It is not. Even just war is lamentable. Instead, the lesson that those knights of Christendom, those cruce signati, teach us is that we must seek repentance, to right wrongs, to perform acts of charity, to care for the poor, to live a life of prayer, to live and even play our sports under the standard of Jesus Christ, for we too, as his disciples, have been signed with the cross.
There